Good morning. So Virgin Active may have got the law fundamentally wrong, and in doing so, it is, in my view, to the detriment of women's rights. And they've picked the wrong person to have this debate with in a public forum, and that is Michelle Dewberry of GB News. So I thought I would do another video on this subject because I think it would help a lot of people, because if you are female or you are male and you've got a female partner, you may be exceptionally concerned about this because they will allow trans women into female-only spaces, and that is to say, with great respect, that is to say, biological men who identify as a woman or even have a gender recognition certificate to say that they are a woman into female spaces, which is fundamentally flawed as a matter of law. Now, I will say that we are waiting a Supreme Court decision for Women Scotland to say whether or not the GRC applies the same protection for trans women as biological women. And I have to say, I hope that it comes out with a common sense approach that protects women's rights. But this is a fundamental issue that we have to address right now, because this is prevalent across the country. I see it all over the place, and I see political correctness gone absolutely mad. For example, I've been standing in a shop with my wife. It is clear we are husband and wife. At least I would hope that it's clear we are husband and wife. And the lady at the counter referred to my wife as she, and her manager over her shoulder told her off and said, "No, we refer to them as the customer." And I thought, this is just utterly ridiculous. And that was simply standing in a shop in line. And I won't embarrass the retailer to say who they are, but that was that. But let's go to this debate here, because this absolutely blew my mind as to what happened with Michelle Dewberry at Virgin Active. So she posts here on X, after encountering a man in the female changing room at Virgin Active, she said, "I asked the gym to clarify their policy and received this response." And I'll show you that in a minute. She says, "How has it become commonplace for adult males to now be allowed into our single-sex changing rooms? How come us females were never consulted about this? Whatever happened to our right to a single-sex changing space?" Now, I'm going to fill that blank here, because the blank that a lot of people may be confused with, because this is pushed in your face so much, is the fact that this is still protected in law. Only these companies are not applying that protection for who knows only what reason, to be virtue signaling, to be inclusive in inverted commas, and to please the minority, etc., to the detriment of everybody else that actually wants to protect those spaces. Now, I understand that there are some biological women that just don't care and they think it's fine, but I suspect they will care if and when, because it will be when rather than if, a transgender woman who is actually a man masquerading as a transgender woman will then attack a woman in a woman's only space because they've got easy access to that space. I suspect that will change their views somewhat. Michelle Dewberry goes on and says, "If you are among the minority of women who are comfortable sharing your single-sex changing room with adult males, I completely respect that, as do I. But what about the majority of us who aren't?" She said, "I, for one, don't agree with the policy, and so I've cancelled my membership of that gym as a result." And here's a screenshot of her cancellation. And here is the response from Virgin Active when she queried what their policy is on allowing biological men who identify as women into female spaces. This is what Virgin Active said. They said, "Hi, Michelle. I hope this email reaches you well. The changing room was a split between female and male, with children attending up to the age of 8 years old of a different gender." So that's fine. I mean, you take your children to a gym, you don't really want to be segregated and whatever, you want to protect them, that's fine. For the female changing rooms in particular, this would cover females of all ages, boys up to the age of 8 years old, which I know some people might be uncomfortable with, but generally speaking, I think most people are okay with that. Transgender females, and this is where it gets thick, transgender females and non-binary members. Now, aside from the fact that the Supreme Court has already rejected a non-binary third category on passports, the Supreme Court said no, it's not a breach of any rights for the passport office to say you are male or female. And for the avoidance of doubt, if you obtain a GRC, that can change things, but the Supreme Court said there's no third option. We don't have non-binary. You're male or female. And so this just doesn't exist in law in the sense that non-binary is not a category that would be recognized on a passport, for example. But nonetheless, you might therefore have a biological male who says they are non-binary and therefore have access to the female changing rooms. But you may also have biological men who just self-identify as a woman and therefore have access to the female changing rooms, thus obliterating the female changing rooms. Now, a lot of people wonder, what's the law on this? Because the law does say, and this is where it gets somewhat confusing, the law does say that there is a protected characteristic for those that have undergone gender reassignment or proposing to undergo gender reassignment, and even those, especially those that have gone the full way and obtained a gender recognition certificate. Now, that's not without its criticism, but by the by. Now, this came to the forefront in another story I covered some while ago, which also attracted Dr. Michael Foran's attention, who gave comment on this as well, which is where there was guidance published that said trans teachers must be allowed to use the same showers as female colleagues, schools were told. And this was fundamentally misunderstood the law. And I did another video on it, which you can see linked down here. I'll find it. I'll link it below. And then we go to GB News. Obviously, Michelle Dewberry of GB News was going to cover this on GB News. So they approached Virgin Active to get a response so they can give them the opportunity for comment. You see, news companies tend to do that. If they write a story, they give them opportunity for comment. I don't need to do that because I'm not a news company. I'm just a legal commentator. So here's what Virgin Active said to GB News. Media request, re-changing rooms and gender. Here is our statement. And this is the fundamental key flaw here. In accordance with UK law and industry guidance, which are mutually exclusive, by the way. The UK law is what it is. It's nothing to do with the industry guidance. We respect the choice of our members to use the changing room facilities based on the gender they identify with. So if I were a member of Virgin Active and I said, I think I'm female today, they say I can walk into the female changing rooms. That is what they say. But the problem here is they say in accordance with UK law that they allow that. Now, that is fundamentally flawed, and I will point out precisely why in just a moment. And hopefully they change this policy. I doubt it. Perhaps they will, but we'll see. They say we support and respect all our members and their safety, and privacy remains our highest priority. Well, with the greatest respect, Virgin Active, you do not. Because, in my view, because if you did respect all your members and their safety and their privacy, then you would respect the dignity of all the women that want a single-sex, female-only space and not allow biological males who identify as female, even if they have a gender recognition certificate, to enter the female spaces. If you did, you would prevent that from happening. And because you don't, in my view, you don't support and respect all members, and you don't support and respect their safety and their privacy and their dignity and everything else. They say, we continue to ensure our policies remain legal, fair and inclusive. Now, here's the difficulty. They cannot necessarily remain legal, fair and inclusive all at the same time, because to remain inclusive would say everybody can use the changing rooms if they please. But that's not really fair on the vast majority of women that use those spaces. And it certainly isn't legal. And again, I'll explain why in a moment. But Michelle Dewberry here commented on it on GB News. I'll play this and then I have a few more things to say.
If you followed my saga about my gym, I was minding my own business, leaving my gym changing room the other day. And if you followed my story, I was quite surprised, to put it mildly, to see a man in there. And I clarified the policy with Virgin Active. They surprised me, ladies and gents, by telling me that in the female changing room, children were allowed, transgender females, females of all ages, and non-binary members. What does that actually mean? Anyway, I clarified it with Virgin Active. They've now given me a statement saying, in accordance with UK law and industry guidance, we respect the choice of our members to use the changing room facilities based on the gender that they identify with. We support and respect all of our members, and their safety and privacy remains our highest priority, and will continue to ensure our policies remain legal, fair and inclusive. So let me just remind ourselves of that line there. We respect the choice of our members to use the changing room facilities based on the gender they identify with. Excuse me? So a man according to this Virgin Active policy, a man doesn't need to do anything to himself at all. He can just go into the female changing room where there's little girls and women, and they're allowed to be there because they identify as female. Well, excuse me, we don't have self-ID in this.
And so I agree with that sentiment entirely. And let me move to what I coined in my previous video as the very problem here. The problem here is these companies are either just trying to be inclusive and please everybody, but in doing so actually displeasing half of the population, which leads me to think that are they just trying to please the 1%? Because that certainly won't please the vast majority of the 50% of the population, i.e. women, that would probably, the vast majority of whom would probably not want biological men in their spaces, regardless of how they identify, or they misunderstand the law. And I'm not really sure which it is. It's got to be one of those. It's either they want to please everybody and they therefore not really take into account of what half the population really want, or they're trying to please the 1%, or they just misunderstand the law. It has to be one of those. Now, the law is misunderstood, and therefore I think these companies take the least risky approach by trying to avoid claims for discrimination from that 1%. I say 1%, whatever the percentage is, I don't know without looking it up. But they try to avoid legal suits by doing that. And this is where I coined exactly that problem. The problem that we have is the understanding and the interpretation of these laws and then how they are implemented. The result is that most organizations will probably implement them in accordance with the least possible risk to them from a legal standpoint. And so I'll link that video below. And just a reminder of the law as it is, whilst there is a protected characteristic of gender reassignment under the Equality Act, there is also, and I will bring on both the guidance explanation and the law as it is. The law that allows these companies to discriminate. Now, people hear discriminate, they think that's illegal. Well, there is unlawful and lawful discrimination. Discrimination just means you treat them differently. Now, that may be lawful, it may be unlawful. And so it would be lawful if there's a good reason. So you can discriminate if there's a lawful good reason. And this is one such good reason. This is Schedule 3 of the Equality Act 2010, paragraph 28, under gender reassignment, which is talking about if you would ordinarily be contravening the Equality Act by discriminating against somebody on the basis of gender reassignment, which is a protected characteristic, you do not contravene the discrimination restrictions if, and it says here, a person does not contravene Section 29 so far as relating to gender reassignment discrimination only because of anything done in relation to a matter within subparagraph 2 if the conduct in question is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. In English, that means if there's a legitimate aim of, i.e. protecting women, biological women in biological women's spaces, that the proportionate means of doing that is excluding trans women, biological men identifying as women, or in this case, non-binary men, not, men that identify as non-binary, you know what I mean? By excluding them from women's spaces would be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The legitimate aim being protecting the vast majority of women using those spaces. And the matters here referred to within subparagraph 2 are as follows. The provision of separate services for persons of each sex. B, the provision of separate services differently for persons of each sex. So separate services, the provision of separate services differently, which is very subtly different. And C, the provision of a service only to persons of one sex. So let's say you have a women-only gym, for example, that is a service only to persons of one sex. And similarly, if you had a separate service, so let's say you've got bathrooms, shower rooms, and whatever, they are separate services for persons of each sex, or you're providing different services for persons of each sex, so they might provide certain services for women that they don't provide for men and vice versa and so on. So you do not cut these companies, and I really hope these companies watch this video, frankly, and learn the law that they are not discriminating unlawfully if they provide single-sex spaces for women and exclude trans women from those spaces. Now, I'm not hating on trans women, and I'm not or trans men for that matter. If someone identifies and they have gender dysphoria and they don't identify in the body into which they were born, I absolutely respect that. It must be very difficult, but it does frustrate me when companies don't understand the law, they don't apply the law, and in doing so, they are just trying to avoid the complaints from a very tiny percentage and possible lawsuits from a very tiny percentage to the detriment of the vast majority of people that use those spaces. And there is further guidance on this as well, which I will try to find. I've put it in here somewhere here. This is a parliamentary publication, Balancing Rights in Single-Sex Services, an explanatory document. I'll have to blow it up a little bit, otherwise you won't really see that. It's the bit that's highlighted. This is exceptions allowing services to be provided only to women or only to men. The first two relevant exceptions, Schedule 3, paragraphs 26 and 27, allow service providers to provide separate services for men and women who provide services to only men or women in certain circumstances. The symmetrical nature of the ban on sex discrimination means without these exceptions, it would be illegal, for example, to hold women-only sessions at a leisure centre or a new father support group at a nursery, both of which obviously would be ridiculous to make those illegal. I would hope would be obvious. And now on to the main highlighted point. Exceptions allowing single-sex services to discriminate because of gender reassignment. And this explanation is as crystal clear as it really should get. The third exception, Schedule 3, paragraph 28, the bit that I've just read out before, allows providers, so I hope they watch this video, I hope they listen to it, I hope they change their policies, because this is what the law says, black and white. Allows providers of separate or single-sex services to provide a different service to or exclude someone who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. This includes those who have a gender recognition certificate, as well as someone who does not have a gender recognition certificate, but otherwise meets the definition of the Equality Act 2010. So they are proposing to undergo, or whatever gender reassignment. Application of this exception must be objectively justified as a means of achieving a legitimate aim, which just means they have to give some thought to it, and that the thought process is, this is a single-sex space for women, therefore we think that it should be a proportionate and legitimate aim to exclude trans women from those places. An example given in the explanatory notes of the Act is the group of counselling services for female victims of sexual assault, where the organisers could exclude a woman with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment if they judged that the clients would be unlikely to attend the session if she was there. Schedule 23, paragraph 3 of the Equality Act allows a service provider to exclude a person from dormitories or other shared sleeping accommodation and to refuse services connected with providing the accommodation on the grounds of sex gender reassignment. As with paragraph 28 and other exceptions of the Equality Act, such exclusion may be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And not only that, Dr. Foran raises an interesting point in this older thread here, which I will endeavour to remember to link in the description below, but says, this guidance misstates the law. Regardless of whether a GRC changes someone's sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, there are clear exceptions in Schedule 3 that make it lawful to exclude trans women from communal female-only shower. Not only that, and here's the interesting point, failing to provide a single-sex service in a communal setting where women are in a state of undress is highly unlikely to itself be unlawful discrimination. So ironically, these companies, by failing to provide an absolutely exclusive single-sex space, may in doing so be breaking the law and unlawfully discriminating against those women. And in this case, in Michelle Drewbury's example, encountering a man in the female spaces, failing to provide a dedicated single-sex space may itself be unlawful discrimination. Dr. Foran continues, this guidance needs to make both of these points clear if it's to be an accurate reflection of the law. And goes on to say, well, there's some uncertainty about the establishment conditions for a female-only space if it means certified sex, and that's the Supreme Court case that's going on. Regardless of that, it doesn't make that guidance correct, and wherever they got their advice from on the law, it's wrong. And I respectfully suggest that Virgin Active have made the same mistake. So there's my few thoughts on that. I'll link the posts and everything in the description below. If you use a gym or you have a partner, a wife, a girlfriend, a child, obviously a child can be anyone up to the age of 18 who uses a gym, you may well want to write to that gym and ask them to clarify the point on the law. And if they come back with this nonsense, send them my video. And if they still don't change the policy, then I would personally be cancelling the membership. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, because I think this is leading down a road which is utter madness. Even to the extent now that we get, and I'll do it on the fly, I have to blur out images for copyright reasons, etc., and dignity to some degree. But while I'm doing that, I will then put the article on screen. This one here. We get articles like this. Fourth British man to give birth reveals how he did it and why he doesn't care that he's listed as mother on the birth certificate. Well, this kind of article here goes through and explains that a woman who suffered gender dysphoria, which again, I have full respect for anyone suffering gender dysphoria, but then underwent certain surgeries, removing ovaries, but before doing so, froze eggs, but obviously retained enough of the female organs to have a child, then conceived a child. So respectfully, there's no miracle here. It's a woman who suffered gender dysphoria, who underwent surgery to then identify as a man, but then conceived a child. Biologically, as a woman conceived a child. So this is the sort of headline that this results in. And this is the sort of legal ambiguity that this case results in, because this article says that this person remains both legally male and legally female simultaneously, because obviously to give birth, you are a woman and therefore listed as mother. And this was the very debate going on in the Supreme Court, which was to decide whether or not those who obtain a gender recognition certificate should have the same legal protected status as a biological woman, which would throw everything that I've said in this video into complete madness if the Supreme Court rules that trans women have exactly the same rights as biological women, because that would be, quite frankly, an absurd position in law and completely abolishing women's rights as we know them. So respectfully, I hope that the court does come out with a sensible decision on that, and that we await. So let me know your thoughts and comments in the box below, respectfully please, as always. Just as a caveat, none of this video is intended in any way to upset anybody. This is a robust legal discussion on very real issues that affect a lot of people. If you are affected by this, do go and seek some assistance. But otherwise, leave me your thoughts and comments below. Please do subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.